The evening began like any other, at one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. Diners filled the elegant space, their laughter and conversations mingling with the soft hum of music and the clinking of glasses. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect scene, a quiet storm was brewing. At a table near the entrance sat a man dressed plainly, his simple attire contrasting sharply with the polished ambience around him. He seemed out of place, drawing subtle glances and whispers from both staff and patrons. What no one knew was that this man, quietly observing the room, wasn't just another diner. He was David Harrison, the owner of the establishment, there to uncover a truth he'd only heard in whispers, truths that would expose the cracks beneath the restaurant's pristine facade. But what began as a silent investigation soon spiraled into an evening of humiliation, cruelty, and betrayal. And when David finally revealed his identity, the shockwave it sent through the restaurant would leave no one untouched. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story of redemption and transformation, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this story inspires you, don't forget to hit subscribe to join us for more. The restaurant was alive with its usual elegance, soft music playing in the background, the clinking of glasses resonating like gentle chimes, and the tantalizing aroma of gourmet cuisine wafting from the kitchen. It was a space designed for comfort and indulgence, a sanctuary where patrons could escape the grind of daily life and immerse themselves in culinary bliss. At one corner of the room, seated near the entrance, was a man who appeared out of place amidst the refined crowd. His simple attire, a pair of jeans and a modest sweater, contrasted sharply with the polished appearance of other diners who were dressed in crisp suits and flowing dresses. His name was David Harrison, and though he blended into the backdrop like an ordinary customer, he was far from it. David wasn't just another guest at this renowned establishment. He was the owner and mastermind behind its rise to prominence. Over the past 5 years, he had poured his heart and soul into transforming the restaurant from a modest eatery into one of the city's premier dining destinations. It was his dream realized, a place where great food, exceptional service, and an inviting atmosphere merged to create magic. But tonight, David wasn't here as the owner. He had come incognito, hoping to witness the experience from a customer's perspective. Over recent months, whispers of discontent had reached his ears. Anonymous reviews on social media, murmurs from regular patrons, and even feedback from a trusted manager. These accounts suggested a troubling shift in the restaurant's culture. A growing arrogance among some staff members, a tendency to judge customers by their appearance, and a subtle but unmistakable lack of respect for certain diners. It wasn't blatant, but David knew all too well that small cracks could quickly deepen into irreparable fractures. So, here he was, choosing to observe firsthand the establishment he had built from the ground up. He didn't wear the designer suits or carry the air of authority he usually projected. Instead, he hoped to fade into the background, just another face in the crowd. His objective was clear: to ensure that every guest, no matter their background or appearance, received the warmth and respect the restaurant promised. David's observant eyes scanned the room, taking in the details he might have missed during his previous visits in his official capacity. The dim, ambient lighting cast a golden glow over tables adorned with pristine linens and gleaming cutlery. The atmosphere buzzed with quiet conversation, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Most of the patrons seemed at ease and comfortable in the upscale setting. Yet, David couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in energy whenever someone who didn't fit the typical mold entered. It was in these quiet observations that David began to see what he had feared. Staff members occasionally exchanged glances when certain guests walked in. Quick, subtle appraisals followed by barely noticeable shifts in demeanor. Conversations became more clipped, smiles less genuine. While most customers likely wouldn't catch on to the nuances, David recognized them for what they were: judgments cloaked in politeness. As he waited for a server to approach, David noted the stark contrast in how some tables were treated compared to others. The servers bustled around groups dressed in business attire, engaging them in light-hearted banter, their smiles warm and genuine. Meanwhile, tables with more casually dressed diners seemed to receive far less attention, their presence acknowledged but not celebrated. Finally, a waitress named Sophia approached his table. Her name tag was neatly pinned to her crisp uniform, but her demeanor was far from welcoming. Her smile was polite but mechanical, her posture rigid, and her tone laced with disinterest. "Yes," she said curtly, barely looking him in the eye. David offered a polite smile, brushing off the subtle coldness in her approach. "Good evening. I'd like to order a meal." Sophia nodded, pulling out her notepad with a sigh so faint it was almost imperceptible. "What would you like?" she asked, her voice devoid of the warmth she had shown to other tables. David glanced at the menu and made his selection, keeping his tone friendly. "I'll have the house special, please." Her pen scratched against the notepad for a moment before she turned on her heel and walked away without another word. David watched her retreating figure, his mind racing with mixed emotions. He reminded himself that he wasn't here to confront anyone, not yet. Tonight was about observation and gathering the evidence he needed to address the underlying issues. As he sat waiting for his meal, David continued to absorb the subtle dynamics of the restaurant floor. A couple of servers exchanged whispered comments, casting fleeting glances in his direction. The patrons, seated at neighboring tables, seemed oblivious, engrossed in their own conversations, but David couldn't ignore the faint sense of exclusion that hung in the air. When Sophia returned, she placed his drink on the table with an indifferent nod, not bothering with pleasantries or small talk. The disparity between her interactions with other guests and her treatment of him was stark. As David sipped his drink, he felt a growing unease settle over him. He had built this restaurant to be a place where everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, could feel welcome and appreciated. Yet, sitting here now, he felt like an outsider in his own establishment. By the time his meal arrived, David's initial sense of curiosity had morphed into disappointment. The dish was presented with little care, the plating haphazard and uninspired. The food itself lacked the finesse and attention to detail that had become the restaurant's hallmark. "Is there anything else you need?" Sophia asked, her tone flat and detached. David shook his head. "No, thank you," he replied, forcing a smile. As she walked away, he couldn't help but notice the quiet glances and hushed whispers that continued among the staff. It was as though his presence disrupted the carefully curated image they aimed to project, a reminder that appearances weren't everything. David took a few bites of his meal but found little enjoyment in the experience. The flavors, once bold and refined, now felt muted, overshadowed by the bitterness of what he had observed. By the end of the evening, David had seen enough. As he placed his napkin on the table and left a generous tip despite the poor service, he walked out of the restaurant with a heavy heart. His mind was already working through the steps he would need to take to reclaim the values that had defined his restaurant from the beginning. Tonight, he had come as an anonymous diner, a silent observer. But the next time he returned, it would be as the owner, a man determined to restore the integrity of the establishment he had poured his life into. The following evening, David returned to his restaurant with a heavy sense of determination. Though his visit the previous night had left him disheartened, it had also strengthened his resolve to dig deeper into the growing issue. He needed to confirm that what he had experienced wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a pattern of behavior taking root in his establishment. This time he dressed just as modestly, jeans, a plain shirt, and a worn jacket. His intention remained the same, to observe his staff without the influence of his authority looming over them. As he stepped through the restaurant's doors, he felt the familiar hum of activity envelop him. The soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of utensils, and the faint background music that tied it all together. But almost immediately, David noticed it again. The subtle shift in the atmosphere. Eyes turned in his direction as he entered, scanning him briefly before flicking away as if dismissing his presence altogether. Among the staff, a few exchanged quick glances, accompanied by faint smirks or raised eyebrows. It was subtle, barely perceptible to anyone not looking for it, but to David, it was glaringly obvious. He chose the same seat as before, a small table near the window that offered a view of the bustling dining room. He could already feel the tension building around him, a quiet yet persistent unease that hadn't been there during his previous visits as the recognizable owner of the establishment. It didn't take long for Sophia to spot him. Her initial reaction was one of surprise, her eyes narrowing slightly as she registered his face. For a moment, she hesitated, lingering by another table as though debating whether to approach him. Then, with an almost exaggerated sigh, she made her way over. "You're back," she said, her tone dripping with disbelief. David forced a small smile, determined to keep his composure. "Yes, I thought I'd come again. I enjoyed the atmosphere last night." Sophia's lips twisted into a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, drawing out the word as if she were humoring him, "I suppose we can accommodate you." She pulled out her notepad, tapping her pen against it with faint impatience. Her entire demeanor radiated irritation, as though his presence alone was a burden. "I'll have the chef's special, please," David said, keeping his tone polite. Sophia jotted down the order with a bored expression, muttering something under her breath that David couldn't quite catch. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him to once again observe the interactions unfolding around him. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. At a table nearby, two diners leaned closer to each other, casting glances in his direction. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and disdain, their words barely audible over the ambient noise of the restaurant. "What's he doing here?" one of them muttered. "I don't know," the other replied, her tone dripping with derision. "Doesn't seem like he fits in, does he?" David pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the activity within the dining room. He could see the difference in how the staff treated other patrons. Those dressed in sharp suits or elegant dresses received attentive service, warm smiles, and genuine engagement. Meanwhile, diners who appeared more casually dressed, like himself, were given little more than perfunctory attention. When Sophia returned with his drink, she set the glass down with a clink that was just a bit too loud, her posture stiff and uninviting. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone curt. David shook his head. "No, thank you," he replied simply. She turned on her heel and walked away, making no effort to engage him in conversation or offer the friendly demeanor she had displayed at other tables. As the minutes passed, David found himself reflecting on the environment that had developed within his restaurant. This wasn't the place he had envisioned when he first opened its doors. He had wanted to create a space where people from all walks of life could feel welcome. A sanctuary where the quality of service was consistent, regardless of who the customer was or how they looked. But now, sitting here as an anonymous diner, he could feel the judgment in the air, the unspoken message that he didn't belong. When his meal finally arrived, Sophia placed the plate on the table with little care, her expression one of mild disdain. The dish itself, though undoubtedly prepared with skill, lacked the meticulous attention to detail that David knew his chefs were capable of. He took a bite, but the flavors seemed muted, overshadowed by the bitterness of his observations. Around him, the faint whispers and sidelong glances continued, a constant reminder of the subtle prejudice that had crept into the very heart of his establishment. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere became increasingly suffocating. Sophia's demeanor grew colder, and her interactions were more dismissive. She barely concealed her disdain, her posture radiating an almost hostile energy. It was clear that the staff, and even some of the patrons, had formed an unspoken consensus about him. He didn't belong here. By the time David finished his meal, he had seen enough to confirm what he had suspected. This wasn't a one-time occurrence or the actions of a single staff member. It was a systemic issue, a culture that had quietly taken root within the restaurant, fueled by prejudice and arrogance. David paid his bill and left another generous tip, despite the poor service. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This wasn't just about a rude waitress or a few judgmental glances. It was about something far deeper, a betrayal of the values he had worked so hard to instill in his restaurant. And it was something he couldn't ignore any longer. Tomorrow, he would return. But this time, he wouldn't come as an anonymous customer. He would walk through those doors as the owner of this establishment, ready to confront the toxic culture that had taken root within its walls. The third evening arrived, and with it, a quiet tension in David's chest. He couldn't shake the disappointment that lingered from the 2 nights prior, but he knew he had to face the issue head-on. This time, he dressed the same. His unassuming attire now felt like armor as he prepared to witness the extent of the problem festering in his restaurant. As he stepped through the doors, the familiar symphony of clinking glasses and hushed conversation greeted him. But once again, there was a noticeable shift in energy as he entered. Whispers broke out among some of the staff. A few patrons glanced up, their expressions tinged with curiosity or veiled amusement. Sophia spotted him almost immediately. Her reaction was impossible to miss. A faint smirk tugged at her lips, her posture shifting ever so slightly into something more dismissive. She leaned toward a nearby server, whispering something that elicited a quiet chuckle. David took his usual seat by the window, the same table he had chosen the previous night. As he settled into the chair, he could feel the eyes of the staff on him. The judgment and disdain weren't even subtle anymore. They hung in the air like a thick fog. It didn't take long for Sophia to approach. Her footsteps were deliberate, almost exaggerated, as though she were making a point of showing her reluctance to serve him. "Well, you're back again?" she said, her tone dripping with mock surprise. "Can't seem to stay away, can you?" David kept his voice steady, refusing to rise to her bait. "Yes, I've enjoyed the ambience here," he replied simply, offering a small smile. Sophia's lips curled into a smirk. "Ambiance, huh? Well, let's see what we can do for you tonight." She handed him the menu with a sharp motion, almost tossing it onto the table. The pages fluttered slightly as they landed, and she didn't wait for a response before walking away, her laughter mixing with that of another server nearby. David opened the menu, scanning it quickly before setting it down. He didn't need to read it. He already knew what he would order. When Sophia returned, her expression still laced with amusement, he gave her his request, the special. Her reaction was almost imperceptible. A brief flicker of something in her eyes before she jotted it down. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, though her tone carried a hint of something more sinister. As David waited for his meal, the atmosphere grew heavier. He caught snippets of whispered conversations from nearby tables, their words carrying enough disdain to make his stomach churn. "Why does he even come here?" one man murmured to his companion. The woman replied with a soft laugh. "Maybe he's trying to prove something. Doesn't he realize he doesn't fit in?" David clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain composed. He had faced judgment before, but this was different. This was happening in the very space he had worked so hard to create, a space meant to embody inclusivity and respect. When Sophia returned with his plate, she set it down with a thud that drew the attention of a few nearby patrons. Her smirk widened as she stepped back, crossing her arms and watching him expectantly. "You're special, sir," she said, her voice dripping with mock courtesy. David hesitated, sensing something was amiss. Slowly, he lifted the lid covering the dish. What he saw made his stomach drop. A dead rat lay in the center of the plate, its lifeless body arranged as though it were part of a grotesque gourmet presentation. The stench hit him almost immediately, an acrid, nauseating odor that made his stomach churn. Around him, laughter erupted. Sophia's chuckle was the loudest, her shoulders shaking as she tried and failed to contain her amusement. A few of the other staff members joined in, their laughter blending with that of some nearby patrons. David's hands clenched at his sides as he fought to maintain his composure. The humiliation was overwhelming, the blatant cruelty of the act cutting deeper than he expected. He looked up at Sophia, his gaze cold and unyielding, but she only smirked, her eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction. "Is something wrong?" she asked, feigning innocence. "I thought you'd enjoy our special. It's unique, don't you think?" The laughter grew louder, a cruel symphony that seemed to echo in his ears. David's jaw tightened as he pushed the plate aside, refusing to give them the reaction they were clearly hoping for. "I'd like the check, please," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Sophia raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his calm demeanor. She nodded and walked away, her laughter still lingering in the air. When she returned, she tossed the bill onto the table with an air of triumph, her smirk as smug as ever. David didn't say a word. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and left a generous tip, an act that seemed to confuse her momentarily. As he stood to leave, David took one last look around the room. The staff who had mocked him, the patrons who had joined in the laughter, the toxic atmosphere that had taken root, it was all painfully clear. They didn't know who he was. They didn't realize that the man they had ridiculed was the very person who had built this establishment from the ground up. But they would soon find out. David walked toward the door, his steps measured, his expression calm. As he reached the entrance, he turned back, taking in the scene one final time. He felt the weight of their judgment, their disdain, but he also felt something stronger, resolve. This wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had ever been treated as less than, who had ever been humiliated, simply for not fitting someone else's narrow expectations. And he would make sure that the people responsible for this night's cruelty faced the consequences. Tomorrow he would return, not as an unassuming diner, but as the rightful owner of this establishment. And when he did, there would be no more laughter. The next evening, David returned to his restaurant. But unlike the previous nights, this time he didn't come as a humble observer or a silent witness. Tonight, he walked through those doors as the owner, a man prepared to reclaim the values his establishment had lost and to hold those responsible accountable. The restaurant was already bustling when he arrived. Staff moved about with practiced efficiency, carrying plates of artfully arranged dishes, filling glasses with fine wine, and engaging in light-hearted banter with the patrons. To an outsider, everything appeared as it should, polished, professional, and welcoming. But David knew better. Beneath the surface of this carefully curated facade lay a toxic culture he could no longer ignore. As he stepped inside, a ripple of unease passed through the room. The staff recognized him immediately, though it took a moment for the realization to settle in. Whispers broke out among the servers, and several employees exchanged nervous glances. Sophia was the first to react. She froze mid-step, her eyes widening slightly as she spotted him standing near the entrance. For a moment she seemed unsure of what to do. Then, her familiar smirk returned, though it lacked the confidence it had carried the night before. "Well, well," she said, crossing her arms as she approached him. "Back again, I see." David met her gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "I'd like a table, please," he said, his voice steady. Sophia chuckled softly, glancing around as though inviting the other patrons to share in the joke. "Oh, I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," she said, her tone dripping with mock regret. "Busy place, you know. Popular with a certain kind of crowd." Her words hung in the air, laced with the same thinly veiled contempt she had shown him the night before. Several diners nearby chuckled, their faces alight with amusement as they watched the interaction unfold. David remained unfazed. "I'll wait," he replied simply. Sophia's smirk faltered for a brief moment, replaced by a flicker of irritation. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, David raised his hand in a quiet but commanding gesture. From just outside the entrance, a team of uniformed security personnel stepped into the restaurant. Their presence was immediate and commanding, their expressions serious as they flanked David on either side. Behind them, 2 police officers entered, their professional demeanor cutting through the air of mockery and amusement that had filled the room moments earlier. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The laughter died, replaced by stunned silence. Patrons looked on in confusion, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The staff froze in place, their movements halting as they took in the scene. Sophia's smirk vanished entirely. Her arms fell to her sides, and she took an involuntary step back, her confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of what was unfolding before her. What is this?" she stammered, her voice shaking slightly. David took a step forward, his gaze cold and piercing as he addressed her directly. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. "My name is David Harrison. I am the owner of this establishment." A collective gasp swept through the room, the words hitting with the force of a thunderclap. The patrons, who had moments earlier laughed at David's expense, now exchanged wide-eyed glances. The staff, who had dismissed and disrespected him, stood frozen in place, their faces pale with shock. Sophia's reaction was the most pronounced. Her eyes widened in horror, and she took another step back, her hands trembling as she tried to form a response. "Mr. Harrison, I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I thought—" David raised a hand, cutting her off. "Save your excuses," he said sharply. "Your actions over the past few nights speak louder than any explanation you could offer." He turned to address the room, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I came here to see how my staff treats our customers," he began, his words echoing through the silent dining room. "And what I witnessed was appalling. Disrespect, mockery, outright cruelty, all of it completely unacceptable." His gaze swept over the patrons who had joined in the laughter, their expressions now filled with discomfort and guilt. "To those of you who think this behavior is amusing," he continued, "let me be clear. This restaurant was built on values of respect, inclusivity, and excellence. Discrimination and prejudice have no place here. If you disagree, you are welcome to leave." A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces flushing with embarrassment. Some avoided his gaze entirely, their laughter and judgment now replaced by silence. David turned back to Sophia, his expression hardening. "And as for you," he said, his voice cold, "your behavior has been nothing short of disgraceful. From your disdainful attitude to your deliberate attempts to humiliate me and others, you have violated the very principles this restaurant stands for." Sophia's face crumpled, a look of desperation crossing her features. "Please, Mr. Harrison," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" "It's too late for apologies," David interrupted, his tone firm. "Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position." Sophia's knees seemed to buckle slightly, and she reached out to steady herself against the edge of a nearby table. The realization of her actions, and their consequences, had finally sunk in. At a signal from David, one of the police officers stepped forward. "Sophia, you're being charged with disorderly conduct and harassment," the officer announced, his voice calm but authoritative. Sophia's eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening and closing, as though she couldn't fully process what was happening. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." David's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "Let this be a lesson," he said quietly, his voice filled with both sadness and determination. "Not just for you, but for everyone who thinks they can treat others this way without consequence." As the police escorted Sophia out of the restaurant, the remaining staff looked on in stunned silence. The weight of what had just occurred settled heavily over the room, a tangible reminder of the gravity of their actions. David turned back to the remaining staff, his voice steady as he addressed them. "This is your wake-up call," he said. "This restaurant was built on values of respect and hospitality, and I will do whatever it takes to restore those principles. Anyone who cannot commit to upholding them is free to leave now." No one moved. The staff exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak. They knew that the line had been drawn and there was no room for compromise. David nodded, his expression resolute. "Good," he said. "Then let's begin." The day after Sophia's public dismissal, the atmosphere at the restaurant was tense. The staff who remained arrived for their shifts with an air of unease, their usual camaraderie replaced by whispered conversations and stolen glances. The events of the previous night had shaken them, and the weight of David's words still hung heavy in the air. David, however, felt a renewed sense of purpose as he prepared for the monumental task ahead. He had spent the morning in meetings with his private team, discussing a comprehensive plan to address the toxic culture that had infiltrated his establishment. Change wouldn't come easily, but it was necessary, not just for the success of the restaurant, but for its integrity. That evening, before the restaurant opened its doors to customers, David gathered the entire staff in the main dining room. The tables were cleared, and the soft glow of the chandeliers illuminated the faces of the employees, many of whom looked nervous as they awaited his words. David stood at the center of the room, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He took a moment to survey the group before he began speaking. "I won't sugarcoat this," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Last night was a wake-up call. For all of us. What I witnessed over the past few days was deeply disappointing, not just as the owner of this establishment, but as a person." His gaze swept over the staff, pausing briefly on each individual. Some met his eyes with expressions of remorse, while others looked down, unable to hold his gaze. This restaurant was built on principles of respect, inclusivity, and excellence, David continued. Somewhere along the way, those principles were lost. What I saw, the judgment, the mockery, the outright cruelty, was a betrayal of everything this place is supposed to stand for. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling heavily on everyone present. "But this isn't the end," David said, his tone softening slightly. "It's a chance for a new beginning, for all of us." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "Starting today, we're making changes. Big changes. And I need every single one of you to be on board. If you're not willing to commit to these changes, to the values this restaurant represents, then I invite you to leave now. No hard feelings." A murmur rippled through the group as the staff exchanged uncertain glances. Slowly, a few individuals began to step forward. One of them, a middle-aged chef named Carl, spoke up hesitantly. "Mr. Harrison," Carl said, his voice shaky, "I just want to say, I didn't know it was you. If I had known, that's exactly the problem, Carl." David interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. "You shouldn't need to know someone's status to treat them with basic respect. Every customer who walks through those doors deserves the same level of service and dignity, regardless of who they are or how they look." Carl's face reddened, and he nodded, stepping back into the crowd without another word. David continued, his voice steady. "To those of you who are staying, understand this. We're starting fresh. There will be new policies, new training, and a new standard of conduct. If you can't uphold these standards, you're welcome to leave. But if you choose to stay, know that you're committing to a better future, for yourselves, for this restaurant, and for every customer who walks through those doors." One by one, a few more employees stepped forward, gathering their belongings with quiet resignation. Their faces were a mix of guilt and acceptance as they left the room, understanding that they weren't prepared to embrace the changes David was implementing. When the last of them had gone, David turned his attention back to the remaining staff, the ones who had chosen to stay. Their expressions were a blend of determination and apprehension, but there was also a glimmer of hope. "To those of you who have decided to stay," David said, his tone softening, "thank you. I know this isn't easy, and I know we've all made mistakes, but together we can rebuild this place into what it was always meant to be, a restaurant where everyone feels welcome, respected, and valued." He paused, allowing the tension in the room to ease slightly. "To help us achieve that, I've brought in some people to guide us through the process." David gestured toward a group of individuals standing at the edge of the room. Among them were human resources consultants, sensitivity trainers, and seasoned restaurateurs who had agreed to lend their expertise. "These are professionals who specialize in workplace culture and customer service," David explained. "Over the next few weeks, they'll be working with us to establish new standards, provide training, and ensure that every member of this team is equipped to deliver the level of service our guests deserve." The staff listened attentively as David outlined the upcoming changes. These included mandatory sensitivity training, a mentorship program pairing experienced employees with new hires, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination or unprofessional behavior. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," David said, his voice resolute. "It's about building something better, something we can all be proud of." As the meeting came to a close, David addressed the group one final time. "I want you to know that my door is always open," he said. "If you have questions, concerns, or ideas, come to me. We're in this together, and I'm here to support you every step of the way." The staff nodded, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. For the first time in days, there was a sense of hope in the air, a belief that things could and would get better. As the staff dispersed to begin their shifts or prepare for their training sessions, David felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. This was just the beginning, but it was a strong first step toward reclaiming the integrity of his restaurant. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready for it. With the right people by his side and a renewed commitment to the values that had always defined his vision, David was confident that the restaurant could once again become a place of respect, inclusivity, and excellence. The days following David's meeting with his staff were marked by change. Employees began mandatory training sessions, schedules were adjusted to accommodate the mentorship program, and the entire team committed themselves to a renewed standard of service. Yet, there was one final step David needed to take before he could fully close the chapter on the toxic culture that had taken root in his restaurant, revealing the complete truth of what had happened and holding all those responsible accountable. One quiet morning, before the restaurant opened for the day, David gathered his management team, key staff members, and a few external consultants in the private dining room. A projector had been set up at the front, its screen casting a blank, sterile glow over the dimly lit space. David stood before the group, his expression calm but serious. "I've asked all of you here today to address something that has been weighing heavily on my mind," he began. "Over the past week, I've observed behavior in this restaurant that doesn't align with the values we stand for. What you're about to see is evidence of that behavior." He gestured toward the projector, and the screen flickered to life. A compilation of security footage from the previous nights began to play. The first clip showed Sophia's curt, dismissive interactions with David during his initial visit. Her posture, tone, and body language made her disdain painfully clear. The next clip shifted to the night of the rat incident. It captured Sophia carrying the plate to David's table, the smug smile on her face unmistakable. The camera had also caught the reactions of her colleagues, some laughing, others whispering to one another as they watched the scene unfold. Audible gasps filled the room as the footage played. The team watched in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, shame, and discomfort. For many of them, this was the first time they were seeing the events through an objective lens, and the impact was undeniable. David paused the video and turned to face the group. "This," he said, his voice steady but firm, "is what happens when we allow judgment, arrogance, and prejudice to creep into our culture. It starts small, subtle glances, whispered comments, but it grows. And eventually, it becomes this." He gestured toward the screen, where the image of Sophia's mocking expression was frozen in time. "Let me be clear," David continued. "What you've just seen is unacceptable. It goes against everything this restaurant stands for. And it's my responsibility as the owner to ensure that it never happens again." One of the managers, a man named Ethan, raised his hand hesitantly. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice low, "I had no idea this was happening. I feel like I should have done more to prevent it." David nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Ethan, I appreciate your honesty. The truth is, this wasn't just one person's failure. It was a systemic issue, a culture that developed over time because we didn't address the warning signs early enough. But now that we know better, we can do better." The room fell silent again as David resumed the footage. This time, the clips focused on the reactions of other employees during David's visits. While some had merely stood by, complicit in their silence, others had actively participated in the mockery and judgment. When the video ended, David turned off the projector and faced the group once more. "The reason I'm showing you this isn't to shame anyone," he said. "It's to hold us accountable, to remind us of the standards we set and the consequences of failing to uphold them." He took a deep breath before continuing. "For those of you who were directly involved in the incidents shown here, I want to make something very clear. This is your opportunity to take responsibility. If you're willing to acknowledge your actions, commit to the changes we're implementing, and work to rebuild trust, then I believe you can grow from this experience. But if you can't or won't, this is where our paths diverge." A long pause followed as the weight of David's words settled over the room. Slowly, a few employees stood up, their expressions a mix of guilt and determination. Among them was one of the servers who had laughed during the rat incident. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize how hurtful my actions were at the time. Watching this footage, it's painful to see how wrong I was. I want to make things right." David nodded, offering her a small, encouraging smile. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step. I believe you can make amends, and I'll support you in doing so." Another server, however, stood and shook his head. "I don't think I can work here anymore. he said bluntly. This job isn't what I thought it would be, and I'm not sure I can meet the standards you're setting. David respected his candor, offering him a handshake as he left the room. Thank you for your time here, David said simply. I wish you the best in your future endeavors. As the remaining employees settled back into their seats, David addressed them one final time. This is the turning point, he said. From here on out, we operate with integrity, respect, and accountability. There will be no shortcuts, no excuses. We will rebuild this restaurant into the place it was always meant to be. The room erupted into quiet but determined applause. The staff's expressions filled with a renewed sense of purpose. They understood the gravity of the moment and the opportunity they had been given to start fresh. As the meeting concluded, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew there was still work to be done, but the first steps had been taken. The truth had been revealed, the wrongs acknowledged, and the foundation for a better future laid. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, David felt hopeful. Together, they would transform the restaurant, not just into a place of culinary excellence, but into a beacon of respect, inclusivity, and unity. The reforms David had introduced were already making waves within the restaurant. Staff underwent rigorous training, focusing on empathy, professionalism, and the principles of inclusivity that David had always envisioned. The mentorship program flourished, with senior employees guiding newer hires and emphasizing the values that now define the establishment. However, one evening, just as the team began to find its rhythm again, an unexpected guest walked through the restaurant's doors, Sophia. David was reviewing schedules in his office when his assistant Emily knocked lightly on the door. David, she said cautiously, there's someone here to see you. It's Sophia. David froze for a moment, processing the name. It had been weeks since Sophia's public termination and subsequent legal charges. He hadn't expected to see her again, especially not so soon. Bring her to the private dining room. It's out, David said finally, his tone measured. Moments later, Sophia sat across from David at a small table, her once confident demeanor replaced by a mixture of nervousness and vulnerability. She avoided his gaze, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her coat. Thank you for meeting with me, she said quietly, her voice a stark contrast to the mocking tone she had once used. David regarded her carefully. I'm surprised you came, he admitted. What brings you back here? Sophia took a deep breath, her hands still trembling. I wanted to apologize, she began. Not just for what I did to you, but for everything. For the way I treated customers, for the toxic attitude I brought into this place. Watching everything fall apart after I left, it made me realize how much damage I caused. David leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And what exactly do you want from me, Sophia? I don't expect forgiveness, she said quickly, her words tumbling out in a rush. I know I don't deserve it, but I've been trying to turn my life around since I left here. I've started volunteering at a shelter, working part-time while I go to therapy. I needed to face you and take responsibility for what I did. The sincerity in her voice gave David pause. He had dealt with many apologies in his life, but there was something different about Sophia's. It lacked the self-serving tone of someone looking to save face. Instead, it carried the weight of genuine remorse. Why now? David asked, his voice calm but probing. Sophia hesitated, glancing down at her hands. Because this place meant something to me once, she admitted. Before I let my own bitterness take over. I don't know if it's too late, but I want to make things right, somehow. David studied her for a moment, weighing her words. He thought back to the person she had been before things had gone wrong, the potential he had once seen in her as a promising server. I appreciate your honesty, he said finally. It takes courage to admit when you've made mistakes. Sophia's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her gaze remained fixed on the table. That said, David continued, what happened here wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern of behavior that hurt people. Staff, customers, and this restaurant as a whole. It's not something I can simply overlook. Sophia nodded quickly. I understand. I'm not asking for my job back or anything like that. I needed to tell you how sorry I am, to let you know that I've changed. Thus David was silent for a moment, considering her words. Finally, he spoke. You've taken the first step by apologizing, But making amends isn't about words, it's about actions. If you're serious about change, there are ways you can prove it. Sophia looked up for the first time, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Anything, she said earnestly. David nodded. The shelter where you're volunteering. Keep at it. Show that you're committed to treating people with respect and dignity. If, over time, you demonstrate that you've truly changed, I'll consider supporting you in finding a path forward, whether it's here or somewhere else. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, and she nodded fervently. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. I won't let you down. David stood, signaling the end of their conversation. I hope you don't, he said simply. As Sophia left the restaurant, David returned to his office, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't ignore the harm she had caused, but he also couldn't deny the possibility of redemption. Only time would tell if her actions matched her words. That evening, David shared the encounter with Emily and a few senior staff members. While some were skeptical of Sophia's sincerity, others saw it as a testament to the impact of the changes taking place within the restaurant. It's like a ripple effect, Emily said thoughtfully. When you set a higher standard, it forces people to confront their own behavior. Maybe she really is trying to change. David nodded, though he remained cautious. We'll see, he said. For now, we focus on moving forward. In the weeks that followed, the restaurant continued to thrive. Customers began noticing the shift in atmosphere, the warmth and professionalism of the staff, the genuine smiles, and the renewed attention to detail in every interaction. Word of the restaurant's transformation spread throughout the community, drawing in new patrons who were eager to experience the establishment's commitment to inclusivity and respect. Regulars returned with glowing reviews, praising the staff for their kindness and professionalism. One evening, as David walked through the dining room, he overheard a conversation at a nearby table. This place has changed so much, one customer said, her voice filled with admiration. It's like a completely different restaurant, her companion nodded. It's refreshing to see a business take real action to address its problems. You can feel the difference. David allowed himself a small smile as he continued his rounds. This was the restaurant he had always envisioned, a place where everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from, felt valued and respected. Meanwhile, Sophia kept her promise. Reports from the shelter confirmed her dedication, and over time, David began receiving updates from her supervisors about the progress she was making. It seemed that her words had not been empty after all. Though the path to redemption was long and uncertain, Sophia's journey served as a reminder that even the most broken relationships could be mended with effort and sincerity. David resolved to keep an open mind, not just for Sophia, but for anyone willing to take accountability for their actions and work toward change. After all, the restaurant's transformation had taught him an invaluable lesson: the power of second chances. As the weeks turned into months, David's restaurant blossomed into a shining example of resilience and transformation. The energy within the dining room felt completely renewed. Staff members moved with confidence and pride, engaging customers with genuine warmth. The mentorship program brought out the best in the employees, fostering a collaborative spirit that made even the busiest evenings run smoothly. Yet, amidst the steady growth, the memory of the restaurant's darker days lingered like a faint shadow. For David, it was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, not just to maintain the changes, but to deepen them. One afternoon, as David reviewed feedback from recent customers, a familiar name appeared on the screen: Sophia. She had sent an email updating him on her progress and expressing gratitude for the chance to turn her life around. I wanted to let you know, the email read, that I've continued my work at the shelter and have started training to become a counselor. It's not easy, but it feels right, like I'm finally doing something meaningful. Thank you for believing I could change, even when I didn't believe it myself. David reread the email twice, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. He had taken a gamble on Sophia's potential for redemption, and it appeared that she was proving him right. That evening, during a staff meeting, David shared the update with the team. I know Sophia's actions hurt this restaurant, he began, and I don't expect anyone to forget that, but I think it's important to acknowledge when someone makes an effort to change. Sophia's journey reminds us that accountability and growth can coexist. Emily, who had been one of Sophia's strongest critics, nodded thoughtfully. "I have to admit, I didn't think she was capable of turning things around," she said. "But hearing this, it's inspiring." The conversation shifted to the topic of accountability, as David encouraged the staff to reflect on their own roles within the restaurant's transformation. "Every day we have the opportunity to make choices that either uplift or undermine this place," he said. "It's not just about following rules, it's about embracing the values that make us better as individuals and as a team." Bookmark, go back. The next few weeks brought continued success for the restaurant. New customers flocked to experience its reputation for inclusivity, while regular patrons marveled at the changes. The walls that had once been adorned with standard decor now featured messages of gratitude from guests who appreciated the restaurant's commitment to treating everyone with dignity. One letter, framed near the entrance, stood out in particular. "I came here for dinner last week, unsure of what to expect. As someone who often feels out of place in upscale environments, I've had my fair share of cold shoulders and judgmental stares, but not here. Your staff treated me like I belonged, like I mattered. Thank you for creating a space where people can feel seen and valued." David often stopped to reread the letter, finding renewed motivation in its words. For him, it was a testament to the power of change, not just within the restaurant, but within the broader community it served. Sophia's journey, however, wasn't the only sign of redemption. Other former employees who had been let go or had resigned during the early stages of reform began reaching out to David, hoping to make amends. One such individual was Carl, the chef who had struggled to align with the restaurant's new standards. When Carl requested a meeting, David agreed, though he approached it with cautious optimism. The two met in the private dining room where Carl's nervousness was palpable. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Harrison," Carl began, his voice low. David nodded. "What's on your mind, Carl?" Carl hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Leaving this restaurant was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made," he admitted. "But it forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself, about how I was contributing to the problems here. I've spent the past few months working in smaller kitchens, trying to rebuild not just my skills, but my attitude." David listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "I know I can't undo the mistakes I made," Carl continued, "but I'd like a chance to show you that I've changed. If there's any way I can come back, not as the person I was, but as someone better, I'd be grateful." David studied Carl for a long moment before responding. "Change is never easy," he said finally, "but it sounds like you've taken real steps toward growth. If you're serious about coming back, I'm willing to give you a trial period. During that time, you'll work closely with our team leads to ensure you're fully aligned with our values. Are you prepared for that?" Carl nodded quickly, his relief evident. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "I won't let you down." The conversation marked another turning point for David. By allowing former employees the opportunity to return under strict conditions, he was reinforcing the restaurant's commitment to accountability and growth. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about creating a pathway for genuine redemption. As the restaurant continued to thrive, David began to notice something remarkable. The changes within his staff were rippling outward into the community. Employees who had embraced the new culture carried those values beyond the walls of the restaurant, inspiring others in their own circles to prioritize respect and kindness. One evening, Emily approached David with an idea. "What if we host an event focused on inclusivity and community?" she suggested. "We could invite guests to share their stories and experiences, creating a space for connection and understanding." David loved the idea. Together, they planned an evening that combined great food with meaningful conversation, inviting guests and staff alike to participate. The event was a resounding success. Guests shared heartfelt stories about overcoming prejudice, finding belonging, and the importance of spaces where everyone felt welcome. The staff, too, spoke openly about their personal growth, creating an atmosphere of trust and unity. For David, the event was a culmination of everything he had worked toward. It was more than just a celebration of the restaurant's success. It was a reminder of its purpose. Sophia attended the event as a guest, sitting quietly among the crowd. When it came time for her to speak, she hesitated at first, but then stood, her voice steady despite her nerves. "This place taught me a hard lesson," she began. "I used to think that being good at my job meant serving food quickly or knowing the menu inside out. But I've learned that it's so much more than that. It's about how you treat people, about creating a space where everyone feels like they belong." Her words resonated deeply with the audience, and as she sat back down, the applause was warm and genuine. David watched from the back of the room, a quiet sense of pride swelling within him. This was the power of accountability, growth, and second chances. Months had passed since David first stepped into his restaurant as an anonymous diner, seeking to understand the cracks forming beneath its polished surface. At that time, the transformation had been remarkable. What was once an environment of subtle judgment and toxic behavior had blossomed into a thriving community of mutual respect and genuine warmth. The mentorship program, now a cornerstone of the restaurant's culture, continued to bring out the best in employees. Seasoned staff members eagerly shared their experiences and guided newer hires, ensuring that the lessons learned during the restaurant's rebirth became a permanent part of its foundation. Emily, who had emerged as a natural leader among the team, took particular pride in mentoring younger servers. Her approach was simple, yet effective. Leading by example, she radiated professionalism and kindness in every interaction, making her an invaluable asset to both the staff and the guests. One evening, as the restaurant hummed with the gentle buzz of conversation and the clinking of glasses, David found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He watched from his usual corner table as the staff moved seamlessly through the dining room, their faces alight with genuine smiles. The guests, too, seemed to notice the difference. Laughter bubbled up from one table, while another group leaned in close, savoring both the food and the atmosphere. This, David realized, was the dream he had always envisioned. The restaurant's success hadn't gone unnoticed by the community. Local news outlets ran stories about the establishment's remarkable turnaround, highlighting its commitment to inclusivity and exceptional service. Social media was flooded with glowing reviews from guests who praised the restaurant's welcoming atmosphere and the professionalism of its staff. David knew that maintaining this reputation required constant effort. He held weekly meetings with his team to address any concerns and reinforce the values they had worked so hard to instill. These gatherings became more than just business discussions. They were moments of reflection and growth for everyone involved. During one such meeting, David decided to share a letter he had received from a longtime patron. "I think this sums up what we've been striving for," he said, unfolding the piece of paper in his hands. He began to read. Bookmark back. "Dear David, I've been coming to your restaurant since the very beginning. I've watched it grow from a small bistro into the incredible establishment it is today. But what impressed me most wasn't the food, though it's always been exceptional, or the beautiful decor. It was the way your staff treated me. As an older woman living alone, I often feel invisible when I go out. But every time I visit your restaurant, I'm reminded that I matter. Your team always makes me feel welcome, like I'm part of a family. That's a rare gift, and I want you to know how much it means to me. Thank you for creating a place where people like me can feel seen and valued. With gratitude, Margaret." When David finished reading, the room was silent, the weight of Margaret's words settling over the group. Emily, seated at the front, wiped a tear from her eye. "That's why we do what we do," David said simply, "because every guest, no matter who they are, deserves to feel like they belong." As the weeks rolled on, the restaurant became more than just a dining destination. It became a symbol of what was possible when accountability and compassion took center stage. Other local businesses began reaching out to David, asking for advice on fostering similar environments within their own establishments. David welcomed these conversations, eager to share what he had learned. He spoke at community events, emphasizing the importance of building workplaces that prioritized respect and inclusion. His story resonated with audiences, many of whom were inspired to implement changes in their own lives and businesses. One afternoon, David received an invitation to speak at a regional conference on hospitality. The theme of the event was transforming challenges into opportunities, and David's story was the perfect fit. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of industry professionals, he recounted the journey of his restaurant, from its early struggles to the breaking point that forced him to confront the truth, and finally to its rebirth as a beacon of respect and excellence. The most important lesson I've learned, he concluded, is that change starts with accountability. It's not enough to hope for a better future. You have to take action, even when it's uncomfortable. And above all, you have to believe in the potential for growth, both in yourself and in others. The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation that left David feeling both humbled and inspired. Back at the restaurant, life continued to flourish. Guests from all walks of life came through its doors, drawn by its reputation as a place where everyone was treated with dignity. One evening, as David walked through the dining room, he noticed a young couple sitting near the window. The woman was dressed casually, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, while the man wore a wrinkled button-down shirt. Their nervous glances and hesitant body language reminded David of himself during his early visits as an undercover diner. David approached their table with a warm smile. "Good evening," he said. "Is this your first time dining with us?" The woman nodded, her eyes widening slightly. "Yes, it is. We weren't sure if we'd be, dressed appropriately for a place like this." David's smile deepened. "What matters isn't what you're wearing," he said. "What matters is that you're here. I hope you'll feel right at home." The couple's relief was palpable, and as David stepped away, he felt a sense of pride in knowing that his restaurant had become a place where moments like this were possible. As the evening wore on, David found himself reflecting once again on the journey that had brought him to this point. From the betrayal of his staff's actions to the hard-won reforms that had turned everything around, it had been a long and challenging road. But standing there in the warm glow of the restaurant, surrounded by the laughter and joy of his guests, he knew it had all been worth it. This was his legacy, not just a successful business, but a space where kindness, respect, and community thrived. As the seasons changed and the restaurant flourished, David Harrison found himself reflecting more often on the journey that had brought his establishment to its current state. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a testament to the power of change, a symbol of what could happen when people came together to rebuild something broken. The plaque near the entrance had become an iconic part of the restaurant's identity. Guests often stopped to read its message. "In this place, all are welcome, all are respected, and all are valued. May every guest who walks through these doors feel the warmth of kindness and the strength of community." The words resonated deeply, not only with the patrons, but also with the staff. They served as a daily reminder of the values the restaurant upheld and the hard lessons that had led them there. One evening, the restaurant hosted a special event celebrating its anniversary. The dining room was filled with familiar faces, longtime regulars, local community members, and even former employees who had played a part in the restaurant's journey. David stood at the center of it all, greeting guests and taking in the lively atmosphere. Emily approached him with a smile. "David," she said, "we've got someone who wants to say a few words." She gestured toward the stage at the front of the room, where a microphone had been set up for the occasion. To David's surprise, it was Sophia who stepped forward. The room fell silent as she took the microphone, her posture nervous but determined. She glanced around, meeting the eyes of former colleagues, community members, and finally, David himself. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "I wasn't sure if I should speak tonight, but I felt like I needed to. This restaurant has meant so much to so many people, including me, though not always in the ways I expected." She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the microphone. "When I worked here, I lost sight of what mattered. I let my pride and bitterness take over, and I hurt people because of it. I thought being good at my job was about knowing the menu or handling the rush, but I was wrong. It's about how you make people feel, and I failed at that." Sophia paused, her gaze dropping for a moment before she continued. "But the hardest part of hitting rock bottom was realizing that I didn't have to stay there. Mr. Harrison gave me a second chance, Not by giving me my job back, but by showing me that I could be better, that I could change. She looked directly at David, her expression one of gratitude and humility. Because of this place and the values it stands for, I've learned what it means to treat people with respect and create a space where everyone feels like they belong. I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life. The room erupted into applause, the sound filling the air as Sophia stepped down from the stage. David approached her, offering a handshake that turned into a warm hug. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "Thanks to you," she replied. The rest of the evening was a celebration of all that the restaurant had achieved. Guests shared stories, laughed over meals, and toasted to the future. Emily took the stage at one point, leading the staff in a heartfelt thank you to David for his leadership and unwavering commitment to the team. As the night wound down, David found himself standing by the plaque near the entrance, watching as guests filtered out with smiles on their faces. Emily joined him, a glass of champagne in her hand. "It's been a wild ride, hasn't it?" she said, leaning against the wall. David chuckled. "You could say that, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Emily spoke again. "You know, I think what makes this place special isn't just the food or the service. It's the heart behind it. People feel that when they walk through the doors." David nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "That was always the goal," he said. "To create something that wasn't just a business, but a home. For the staff, for the guests, for anyone who needed it." In the months that followed, the restaurant's reputation continued to grow. It became known not just for its exceptional cuisine, but also for its unwavering commitment to treating every person with dignity. David received invitations to speak at conferences, participate in community panels, and mentor other business owners. Each time, he shared the lessons he had learned, not just about running a restaurant, but about the importance of accountability, inclusivity, and second chances. One day, as he walked through the dining room during the lunch rush, David paused to take in the scene around him. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, their interactions with guests filled with warmth and genuine care. The dining room buzzed with life, laughter mingling with the soft hum of conversation. At a corner table, a family with young children sat enjoying their meal. The kids giggled as a server performed a playful trick with a tray, their parents smiling in appreciation. Nearby, an elderly couple held hands across the table, their plates half finished as they lingered in quiet conversation. This was the heart of the restaurant, the connections, the shared moments, the sense of belonging that made it so much more than a place to eat. David smiled to himself as he continued on his way. Late that evening, as the last of the guests departed and the staff finished their closing duties, David lingered in the quiet of the dining room. The chairs were neatly arranged, the tables reset for the next day, and the soft glow of the chandeliers bathed the space in warmth. Emily approached him, carrying a cup of coffee. "Still here?" she asked, handing him the mug. "Just taking it all in," David replied, his voice tinged with contentment. They stood together in silence, the weight of the restaurant's journey hanging between them. "You did it, you know," Emily said after a while. "You turned this place into something incredible." David took a sip of his coffee, a quiet smile playing on his lips. "We did it," he corrected. As he turned off the lights and locked the doors behind them, David felt a profound sense of peace. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a legacy, a living, breathing testament to the power of change, resilience, and the belief that everyone, no matter their past, could find a place to belong. As the city slept, the restaurant stood as a beacon of hope, ready to welcome a new day, and the countless stories yet to unfold within its walls. This story of David's journey to reclaim his restaurant is more than just a tale of redemption and transformation. It is a reflection of the power of accountability, kindness, and the courage to change. Through his unwavering determination, David not only rebuilt a business, but also created a space that truly embodied respect and inclusion. The narrative highlights an essential truth. Leadership is not just about managing success, it's about addressing failures head-on. David's willingness to confront uncomfortable realities and take decisive action transformed a toxic environment into a beacon of hospitality and warmth. His story is a testament to the idea that true change begins with taking responsibility and holding others accountable, while also believing in the potential for growth and redemption. From Sophia's heartfelt journey to the dedication of the remaining staff, this story reminds us that second chances can lead to incredible transformations when met with sincerity and effort. It teaches us to value every individual, not by their appearance or circumstances, but by their inherent worth. At its core, this is a story about creating a legacy built on compassion, perseverance, and the belief that everyone deserves a place where they feel valued. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. We'd love to hear about your own experiences or reflections. Your stories matter, and sharing them can inspire others too. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more heartfelt stories like this. What did this story make you feel? What lessons did you take away from it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going.